Our scripture text comes from the New Testament, from the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be ignorant. You know that when you were Gentiles, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says, "Let Jesus be cursed," and no one can say, "Jesus is Lord," except by the Holy Spirit. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are variety of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another the working of powerful deeds. To another prophecy. To another the discernment of spirits. To another various kinds of tongues, and to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually just as the Spirit chooses. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Continuing our series on spiritual gifts, we will look at what is commonly called deeds of power. Some places this can be translated as miracles, others simply works. It could be kind of categorized at the very beginning of our text in the different activities of God. And it is kind of typically glossed over because I think kind of the healing or the discernment of tongues seems to be more dramatic. Likewise, one can get into trouble if they're promising deeds or miracles. Yet there are times and places when we encounter strange things, where deeds are in fact powerful, but also where a simple act or gesture can be deeply meaningful in the moment. About 20 years ago, when I was a seminary student, we had the opportunity to go to Ghana and West Africa, and we visited several of the Presbyterian churches in that nation. And it was interesting because to prepare for that, we did some book reports. In fact, I think the book report I had to do was not very memorable. In fact, I vaguely remember it was on some African traditional religions or some of the traditions of the culture there. Something like they were said that you would see roadside shrines or people wearing spirit or ancestor masks, of which we did not see at all. And it was interesting because I found years later that when I did my reading, because I took a class of history of Christianity in Africa, that I'd pull that book out occasionally, but I could barely remember any of the book reports we did before that travel seminar. About the only thing I can remember before that travel seminar is we had a lunch, and I remember that because it was very influential, because it was Dr. Mark Valeri led that. He was a church history professor. He was one of the more conservative members of the faculty. And what was interesting also about Mark is he was pretty vain about his hair. You know, he had kind of salt and pepper hair. He had kind of a Sicilian background, so he always had a perfect tan. You can obviously, he had spent some time in California as well. But it was interesting because kind of his nervous tick was he would adjust his hair. He'd run his fingers. If he was getting ready to say something he really meant, sometimes he'd lick his fingers and kind of make sure, there wasn't any hair covering his ear, because you had to listen to what he said. And it was interesting because after chapel on a Wednesday, we went and sat at the table of lunch. That was kind of the community lunch we had. And Mark had been to French-speaking West Africa and Senegal, had been on this trip to Ghana a few times, and so he was kind of one of the experts about West Africa, and he was not going to go on this trip with us, so he was going to kind of show us the ropes. We thought he'd be talking about the dress code, basically wear nice but modest clothes, and that's kind of what we expected him to say. Instead, what we got was advice on keeping our spiritual lives disciplined before, during, and after our trip. In fact, he said it's very important during the trip to go to all the prayer meetings and stuff, not only that we as a group did, but since we'd be representing kind of the church, the PCUSA, that we'd be over there and represent the church there. And it was interesting because it was right after chapel, and he said this is a good place to get the ball rolling, continue to go to the chapel the next few months. And what I thought was interesting is, I thought he was just going to talk kind of about the cursory kind of cultural differences. He echoed a little bit of what we were going to talk about. When we greet people over there, you always go from right to left, because if you go this way, you're basically kind of backhanding them. And so that was kind of something bad to do. Likewise, he said in this very specific culture, it's just like you talk after dinner. If you were in dinner and eating, you don't talk. And so it was very weird. The entire 10 days we were there, it's just like every meal was silent. That was actual a thing. And then he told kind of some interesting stories about, that when he was a student at Yale Divinity and then later at Princeton when he was getting his PhD, when he went on these trips, he was always the bribe guy, I guess because they found out he was Sicilian or something. And so he would kind of hand out some of the bribes to grease the wheels. And he said, thankfully, you have guides in there and you don't have to do that. But he also emphasized that conditions would be different, that our circumstances would be very different. And we did discover that. Art, my buddy that I was with in kind of the far eastern part when we broke off in pairs, it was interesting because we had Bible study at 4 a.m., because a lot of the people would be going to the market town, and so we would meet at 4 o'clock. We'd wake up, and it was still, 2 or 3 hours till daylight. And so we decided, because we didn't know that there was going to be an offering at the 4 a.m. prayer service, and so we kind of just said, okay, what would you give at like Sunday school, like at a church in the West End or something? It's just like, just give one bill, give $1, it'll be fine. And so we each kind of rolled out, gave $1, and of course they let us do it first, and then everybody else was barely putting in some change. In fact, the guy kind of pulled us aside and said, you were really generous. It's just like, you've given more money than these people will make all day. And so after that, we decided just like, okay, next time we just give our pocket change. You don't want to, stand out too much. But one of the things we also got used to was kind of the welcome, and you usually welcome people with water, like I said, the handshakes. And it was interesting that we also got kind of some prying questions, and it was like, okay, what day of the week were you born? Because one of the things they do over there in Ghana is your nickname is what day of the week you were born. So if you're born on Tuesday, your nickname was automatically Cujo. If you were born on Thursday like me, your nickname was Yao. It was also kind of disappointing because my sweet mate was Kwame, and all this time I thought his name was Kwame. Turns out he was just born on Saturday. And it was interesting because they also got kind of a kick out because it is a Ghanaian thing, and so we would introduce ourselves and it'd be just like, hey, I'm John Welton, I'm Yao. And then they would kind of laugh, and then somebody would say something, and after a couple times you'd realize, when I asked somebody to translate, and it's like, well, why are they laughing a little bit after Yao after they say something? It's like, oh, they're calling you White Thursday. That way they'll know which one we're talking about. which was funny because usually in most of the rooms I was the only white Midwestern guy there. But it was interesting also that this lunch stood out because Mark, as he was preparing for us, he was talking a little bit more to get ready for the spiritual side of things. And he started by saying that this location, it might seem exotic or the culture very different, about the nicknames and all that stuff. But he also kind of said haltingly and said, you also might see some things or it might get a little weird because we would be going into an area where faiths were contending. And he was saying it's just the nature of what is going on in that part of the world is you'll see people of different faiths and it'll be kind of interesting to see. And I remember Mark had kind of harped on this because I had taken Church History 1 the year before. And he was telling just how kind of the center, kind of where Christianity was moving in the world. For example, he said if you were a Christian in the 1600s, you would be a Catholic woman probably wearing a scarf in Portugal, going to a church that was 700 years old. Likewise, in the 1950s, your average Christian was a man in a gray flannel suit at a Midwestern Protestant big steeple church, and you had your wife and your kids, and you went on Sunday, and there is plenty of parking. 20 years ago, our professors like Mark was saying, well, we don't know what's going on in Christianity right now, but we're envisioning a younger couple in a plane on the Atlantic Ocean, flying over the Atlantic Ocean, and we just don't know where they're going to land. If the Pentecostals do really well, you might end up in South America, or you might end up where you are going on your trip. And 2 decades later, now if you found kind of their stereotypical Christian, you would be in Africa. That Christian would be a woman who owns her small business, and she probably worships in a more charismatic or a high Anglican church, and sometimes both. They're kind of just doing whatever they want over there. But the point that Mark was making is the place we were going, it was a space where faiths contended. And at that time, Christianity was starting to kind of edge out Islam, but both were very much in the minority. Maybe the faiths of Abraham luckily or rarely had 35 to 40%. So Mark tried to prepare us for things getting a little bit weird. And he would use the Old Testament examples of kind of what I preached a couple months ago, remembering those strange stories of the Ark of the Covenant, where it was in the cities of the Philistines, and you would have kind of the false idols bow down to it. Likewise, he would tell kind of the stories about how Elijah would contest with the prophets of Baal, and sometimes there would be some final pyrotechnics and would chastise the false prophets. And at first, we were kind of sitting there, and it's like, this sounds a little bit weird, sounds a little bit strange, but it's Mark, maybe that's just him. But we were warned that things could be a bit different. And what we did not expect, though, was how close that the Christian community could come together. In fact, my buddy Art and I, who was, kind of one of our very diverse guys over there, he was Methodist at the Presbyterian Seminary. He's even more diverse now as he's the Baptist pastor at the church in Williamsburg, Virginia. But he and I were lined up for Sunday worship. We were in the town of Kapetwe, which is right on the border of Togo and Ghana. And we were lined up, get ready to process in. It was kind of a big day. They were going to do some baptisms of kids. They were going to do confirmation class and bring in some new members to the church because it was Epiphany. And so we're lined up right there in front of the village church. And then all of a sudden, a car, not a taxi, because usually most people use taxis, but it was actual car, came up, and somebody got out and said, we need the ministers to go to the clinic and pray. And so they grabbed Reverend Anka, threw him in the car, and the rest of the choir just picked up and kind of dragged us along. And so we go to the clinic, and we went to the clinic, and we get there, and there's a woman who is kind of convulsing. She's foaming at the mouth. Reverend Anka said in his local Ewe language. He wanted everybody to pray. They had the choir sing over this gal. He brought out his Bible. He was, kind of blessing this woman as she is in kind of the throes of something or other. And it was interesting because he said, "Come on, Art, come on, John, come on, our guest, you pray too." And Art kind of looks at me, and we just sit there, and it's just like, let's just pray in English. They won't know what we're saying anyways. And so we were just kind of throwing the kitchen sink, praying for protection, everything we could do. And it was interesting because she continued and went on to the hospital, and later we found out that she did get better. Little did we know that we would also be at the same clinic in a few hours. But it was interesting how we were real ready. We were all lined up to go to church. And then right before church start, a third of the church left to go pray at the clinic for this woman. And it was interesting because it was kind of the hottest village on the edge of kind of the dry country. We were there during the dry season. And it was interesting because, like I said, we ended up in that clinic and we ended up later in that hospital as well because we were overheated because not only did we go to that church, but the 2 or 3 surrounding churches to watch all the children be baptized and confirmed in the church. And it was interesting because I kind of sat there with Art when we were leaving the hospital, going to some place that actually had air conditioning, which I know many of us kind of wish we had today. But it was interesting, as Art says, and it's just like, well, that could have gotten worse. And I was just like, it could have. Have you seen the plaques in this church? It's like, it's always people with names like ours who came 100 years ago, got overheated and died. Thankfully, we have some air conditioning. But we got hydrated, we got air conditioned, and we turned out all right. But we found out that was not kind of the only interesting thing that happened on our trip. Our friends Katie and Elise, they had stayed in another village. One, when the power went out, when the storms came in, there was a fire and it kind of swept through town. It blew over a candle. The candle lit the place on fire and burned several hovels and several homes and actually killed a young child. And it was interesting because we were pulling up to their place in kind of the Presbyterian Church of Ghana van/bus we had. And they brought us out and we were kind of part of the funeral service. And it was kind of interesting that, there's 20 or 30 of us from overseas coming over. And we sat there and prayed with them in the community. And it was interesting to see how that affected their lives. It was interesting to see how just one small thing could put a ripple through that community. And I don't know if they kind of remembered it, seeing us, but definitely we remembered it. In fact, when I go back for my reunion, I try to find Art or one of my other friends, and we end up talking about that trip. But in our text today, we like to translate this part of Scripture as deeds of power. It could be simply as works enacted. It could be activities. We could also see it as just the ability to do things. And if we want to be over dramatic too, it could be the lesser type of miracle. It's not quite a sign or a wonder as in the New Testament, but it is something that we are doing actively to help others. A deed that has great effect. Now we try to kind of downplay this in our tradition. As I mentioned in Grace Notes earlier this week, we like to, as Protestants, emphasize faith. Mostly because over the years we have learned that it is hard, or we try to keep track of all the good deeds that we do. Existentially, we've also learned it can be something kind of destructive. Generations past, people were concerned if somebody was left this world in a state of grace. It's interesting, and especially since Mark actually used to do a lot of these studies in the early Americas. But it was interesting because people, if their horse kicked you and you died, and the last thing that you had done was be mean to somebody, perhaps an old couple in their buggy, we forget that road rage was not invented in the time of interstate highways. That in actually Puritan America, there was a little bit of road rage there as well. And so it was interesting that somebody might have some existential kind of trouble with that. And it showed itself in the popular culture at the time. I don't know if you've ever had to take an English class, but some of us had to read some Nathaniel Hawthorne. And in one of his works, it's interesting, and I think it was the work of young Goodman Brown. I think that was what I had to read. And it was interesting that there was this man who had been out into the dark primeval forest. He had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. And it was interesting that it caused such existential dread that Nathaniel Hawthorne says until his dying hour, his life was nothing but gloom. And that's how the author ends that story. His whole outlook on life was shaded from this point of view. He had did something he wasn't supposed to do, and so he had kind of shaded, kind of saw everything as gray, as dark, and had kind of really just infiltrated his life. And this is one of the reasons that we don't put too much emphasis on good deeds, because eventually we do fall short. Perhaps we, in our own time, have driven by somebody whose car has been broken down, and maybe we could have helped, but rather we minded our own business. Likewise, sometimes we have been ashamed of something we have done or not done. Perhaps we have done something that is out of the ordinary. Yet we, as Christians, we can look at our activities, our deeds, as something as a gift of God. And one of the gifts we see today is that people can use their skills. My brother is a very skilled mechanic, and he was kind of our go-to guys in Fort Collins in our 20s and 30s. In fact, our friend group would always go to him because we all had like 10, 15, maybe 20-year-old cars. And of course, my brother could fix it. You never asked me to. I was good at holding the light. My brother would turn the wrench. But it was important because, you also kind of build relationships that way. One of my brother's favorite friends were Todd and Emily. And the reason they became kind of best friends is because my brother was kind of the guy who helped the praise band set up, and Todd was the drummer. But more importantly is when Todd or Emily needed something and he would help them out fixing their car or something, those two were the best at showing gratitude. Their gift or their good deed was making my brother feel welcome. And especially when you're kind of the roadie for kind of the praise band, you don't get much accolades. But he would kind of fix their cars and do that, and they were really good at showing their gratitude. Mostly because that's all Todd and Emily had. They didn't have, a dime to their name as a young couple. But it was interesting because they would invite him over for pizza parties, and of all the friends that would help out, and when he was still in town and couldn't go home, he would go to Todd and Emily's for Christmas and Easter. Their gift he was able to give was gratitude and showing well, and my brother could fix cars, so it was a good deal. But recently, there's also been a change in our culture when we look at doing good deeds. When we think of people doing good things, we might think of Carnegie, who helped build the library, and they would build, libraries in the community, and then the communities would fill them with books. Now NGOs, these non-governmental organizations or foundations, sometimes they'll have a political or ideological bent, and we notice sometimes that they stray away from their original message. Sometimes they have to do some PR work. And so it's important to see if we're kind of outsourcing some of our good works. If we are giving money away, we'll see if they have to do the deeds that they have done in the past. And so it's very important to see how much they are doing, especially if some of those places have big salaries and low percentage of what they are giving. But that is not to say that people from wealthy backgrounds and powerful positions can do great and powerful deeds. One of the fun things about kind of the America 250 celebration is there is a renewed focus on George Washington. Even Ken Burns, who did the series last year to kind of prepare for this, when he did his series, it usually focuses on kind of the common man or woman's impact on history. But even he had to basically say that Washington was one of a kind. It is also interesting in kind of our deconstructive trends that Washington tends to survive all the attempts to tear him down. One can argue that he wasn't the best general. He didn't win every single battle, yet he was the leader that kept the revolution going in its darkest hours. They can look down on George Washington as a slave owner, except for the last 10, 15 years of his life. He prepared his slaves for freedom by apprenticing them to be blacksmiths and other trade. And when he freed them on his death, as he promised, they could transition into a new life with skills and talents able to share. Likewise, there are those who try to shade his faith, saying, well, he was just a deist, someone who believed in kind of a clock-working God who did not involve himself in every part of creation. He wasn't a real Christian, they would say. But they forget that he was in church leadership at his local parish, and he trusted and quoted the providence of God. In fact, when he took the oath of office, he's the one that started, "So help me God." That was not actually in the oath of office. But we also see that his faith, though it may be different than what we envision today, is he was someone who understood the providence or the hand of God. You know, he had seen how the wind was against his enemies, and his army and himself lived to fight another day. Likewise, several times in battle when he was going forward to rush, to encourage the soldiers to fight the good fight, he would have a horse shot from under him. He would show his jacket and there would be bullet holes through it, and yet he was always unharmed. That many brushes with death, one becomes a true believer in the providence and power of God. General and later President Washington comes down to us because he did a great deed of power, and that was to give up power. When the war was over and the peace was met, he resigned his commission and he just went back home. He was not going to start a military dictatorship like Napoleon or somebody else. After 2 terms as president, he did not run for office again. He could have easily been president for the rest of his life. Instead, he went home and sat there under his own vine and tilled and lived a few good years in retirement. Now, many of us wish that we could do great deeds. Sometimes it is simple acts of kindness. Sometimes it is knowing our limits where we know where we can actually help. We are not called to save the world. Thankfully, Jesus already did that. But we may simply do what we can with what gifts we are given. And sometimes that might be strange. Sometimes it might be simple. Yet we may do them with joy and sharing the gifts that God has given us.